Welcome to today's dialogue, and as always, listen dialogically, write down your own insights, and use it as a prompt to expand upon with your own originality. This is about dialogue and learning the tense, mode, and rhythm and register of dialogue, not necessarily about anything particular that is said. Because with this mode of seeing and speaking and listening, one can originate almost anything depending on the situation and what's being explored. So I'm going to talk about a few random insights, which feels a bit like tying up loose ends, and then perhaps go into reading more of what I wrote stream of consciousness style, since I haven't really read it myself yet either. I don't know what I want to talk about first. Maybe I'll start with this. So every now and then that Nextdoor app, where it's like a Facebook for your neighborhood, sends out emails, and it only has a little bit of a teaser sentence of what someone is talking about. And the person was saying that someone broke into their car because they had left their door unlocked. And so they were reminding people to lock their car doors. And what came to mind was that thought, and individuals with that level of thought, are basically taking advantage or looking for opportunities of inattention or mistakes. So if I imagine that I might go around and never make this kind of inattentive or hurried or however it happens, mistake, then I'm less likely to have someone break into my car, not really break in, just open the door because I left it unlocked for them. Almost like I'm saying, maybe someone else needs this stuff more than I do. And where I'm going with this, or where I see next, is that, of course, we've been tending to talk quite a bit about Krishnamurti's teachings lately, because I'm listening to the Ending of Time series, his dialogues with Dr. David Bohm. And in his teachings, he often says, thought is inattention. So, for example, if we're lost in thought, we're not paying attention. And an easy illustration of this is when you have the experience of driving from work to home, and then you get home and you're like, I don't even know how I got here. So there's still something that can move our body and make us take the right mechanical actions, even if thought goes off on its own tangents and literally doesn't even see what's happening. So the process of thought can lead to inattention, or perhaps there's a certain threshold where it is inattention or absent-mindedness as we sense in regular consciousness. But in a sense, thought is inattention through and through. So a certain type of thought, person operating at a certain combination of thoughts, walks around looking for these opportunities where someone might have forgot to lock their doors. Usually it's forgot to lock their doors in most cities, not this person never locks their door, like some safe communities that are mostly going by the wayside. So then attentiveness, awareness, is something that might be on a different level, and not the level of, just to make sure that no mistakes are made where people might steal our stuff. But if we extrapolate that up to attentiveness and what quality of life that would mean for the experiencer in general, that's the part that's fascinating. Lately, when I see a picture of a mushroom, I imagine that the mushroom actually represents the right brain. Like the stem is sort of the connection to the left brain, and then the body of the mushroom, the big part, is like the right brain. And then all those little ribs underneath the mushroom are the corpus callosum. And so in a way, when people take psychedelic mushrooms, they're giving themselves like a surrogate or a pseudo corpus callosum. Because I've been imagining that or wondering if, as the brain continues to evolve, it might have a corpus callosum that connects the entirety of the right and left hemispheres, sort of like the mushroom ribs connecting the whole thing. And so the mushroom has the whole representation of the right brain, but just sort of has a stem for the left, because we have the left brain. And maybe taking psychedelics might be neurogenerative to some effect. And there are studies that show there's some neuroplasticity effects. I can't remember what it was, but it was really interesting. I'll have to find that one eventually. So then the morphology of a mushroom can almost give clues as to the evolution of the human brain, if one chooses to look at life that way. The other thing is, it's possible that as the brain evolves, there'll be no corpus callosum, and the connection will be more, say, in the space or quantum and energetic. So I'm not sure, obviously. This is just a hypothesis that may never be tested, because the thing is that it'll take many years for the brain to evolve that way. So nobody can test that one, right? There's an impossible question. And I was watching a short video by someone on YouTube, and they were talking about affirmations, just some affirmations they use. And one of them was, "That's such good news." That's a good affirmation. But my brain immediately flipped it into something else. Again, not to invalidate what was said, but to say yes, and yes, I see what you say, I like it, and this is what I see. Not only, oh yeah, I'm going to take that affirmation and use it every day, thank you, like taking the thought, but extrapolating and reading between the lines and building something out of it, And that's when language becomes generative within one's own mind. And that's something that happens to bipolar people with the language features. Language itself becomes generative, and we sort of speak in generative ways, not in these thought, ego-based structural ways. So where it went was from "that's such good news" to "that good such..." Let's see if I can say it. "That good suchness is new." That good suchness is new. Or you could say that suchness is new. So one is sort of a statement about a self and an identity. And those statements aren't going anywhere. And they're 100% valid and 100% perfect. And it can be flipped around to be in terms of the moment, or a statement or a point or a pointer to what is. That good suchness is new. What is always new. What is a suchness that is good, as it is new. The new is always good suchness. To me, that sounds like a truthful statement. It sounds like truth. So it seems that one can transmute sentences to a different level of truth, because that such good news is also truth. So that's what it is. It sees the truth and says, yes, and this is the truth that I see. It sees the goodness and says, yes, and this is the goodness that I see. Not what is in the structure of thought in general, which is these foamy-metric forces we've been talking about, which I looked back and I was actually calling them, my gosh, I can never remember. Hence, it must not be the right word. Wow, it keeps disappearing. Oh well, foamy-metric or femometric. But then there was another word. That was the original word we were using. Here it is. Geez. Graphemetric. Graphemetric, because a grapheme is the smallest meaningful contrastive unit in a writing system. A phoneme is a sound unit, I think. Again, I'm not any kind of expert in linguistics or anything like that. Now, the other thing about this YouTuber who said, "That's such great news," or good news. I watched a live training, or an introductory live training by them. And I was watching and watching and watching. And this was some time ago. I want to say maybe 2 or 3 years ago. And then at some point they were talking about, if you're like this, you shouldn't join the training, or you shouldn't try to work with them. And so they're saying things like, oh, you aren't driven, or you're not committed, or whatever. I don't know. I don't remember what they were. But the one I do remember was that they gave an example of somebody that was all excited to work with them, and then did, and then, paid sort of the premium price service that they offer. And then later on, someone came back and said this person was basically probably having a mania or something, and that maybe they didn't feel like it was fair that they paid for that, and then they really couldn't afford it, but they were excited and all that. So basically he was saying, if you're kind of like a manic person or bipolar person, that they don't want to work with you, or you shouldn't try to work with them. And that's fine, right? But it just sort of, I was watching sort of like, oh, this is neat, And then all of a sudden they say that. So then if you think in terms of like re-uncovery and trying to create something that does work, and people are resonant with working with people like us, then that person wouldn't necessarily be one of them, right? And that's perfect too, right? Because it would be, we're not going to put people within the list of resources that don't want to work with people like us. Because a little bit of what we've been talking about, especially yesterday, was that, like, who will listen to us? That's one thing. And that's one of the reasons why I do self-dialogue, is because I can just talk as much as I want. I don't actually need anyone to listen to me. I don't expect people to listen to me. But within the re-uncovery resources, there needs to be some amount of people who listen and work with people who have bipolar. And I was thinking about today how it's not only about working with people with bipolar to help them and heal them and coach them and mentor them and do all these things, support them, but work with people who have bipolar energy, who want to learn from people with bipolar energy, who want to listen in order to co-create with people with bipolar energy, who realize that just because somebody has an energy low and sort of is out of commission for maybe weeks or months at a time doesn't invalidate that they have actually a ton to give and contribute when they do have the energy. And part of the reason why they have that ton of energy and information and gifts and skills and traits to contribute is because of the energy fluctuations. Without that, you don't have the creativity. And this relates to something we were talking about yesterday, how, the shared vulnerability traits of creativity, if a person has, 1 part creativity and 1 part left brain, then if they're able to create creative accomplishments, they're able to also bring them to fruition in the left brain world. And then they have creative accomplishment. But the people who have 2 parts creativity and maybe a slight part being able to bring it to manifestation in the left brain world aren't able to do the creative accomplishments in the same way. And even if they did, it wouldn't be valued to the same extent. It'd be like, oh, this is something a person with bipolar created. Let's put it on the wall in the psych ward, for a few days. Yet someone else can stick a banana on the wall with duct tape, and it's like, whoa. But the thing is, people with the bipolar energy might be going around doing the equivalent of sticking bananas on the wall with duct tape all day long if society was designed for such a thing. So the whole world would become a work of art. Now the thing is, we will get to this place where we're doing that sort of thing, but not asking for any type of credit, because when the world is super artful and creative like that, then nobody asks for or needs credit for much of anything. I didn't expect to go there. That's getting a bit ahead. But the thing that popped into my head related to this is I remember Dr. Ian McGilchrist in one of his YouTube videos saying that he collects art created by mad people or diagnosed people, people with schizophrenia, and maybe people with bipolar. And he's actually creating a book of that. And I'm pretty sure I sent in some of my photos that are kind of apophenia photos that are definite shapes in the clouds that I see. And some of those were taken where I have this feeling like, what's happening? I go outside and then there's this amazing cloud formation. Actually, this happened the other day. There was an event outside and it was an air show. And I wasn't at the air show, but I was sort of nearby watching. And when it finished for the day, and I looked at the clouds, it was formed because of the air show. What was there, so obviously, was a dragon. And so I was sitting with some other people, and I didn't say anything, but I was just wondering if anyone else would notice. Like, we're literally staring at the sky still because it was the air show. Nobody said anything. I didn't feel like pointing it out, but I took a picture and I sent it to a couple friends, and they're like, oh my gosh, a dragon. So what I was saying about Dr. Ian McGilchrist, and I think he's amazing, and this other YouTuber I was talking about, I think that person is amazing too. So when I'm saying these little subtle extrapolations and yes ands, if that person were my friend, I would just send that to them instead of be talking to myself on video audio about it. And they'd probably be like, oh yeah, that's great, if they were a resonant friend. And so Dr. Ian McGilchrist, he collects art of people who have a diagnosis for whatever reason. And I think he finds it interesting, or it's a look into the psyche, or I don't know if he ever says, this is sort of right brain art, or, even if it's just basic drawing on a page, it's almost like the right brain is in kindergarten. So somebody goes to the psych ward for the first time, the right brain's in kindergarten, and they're drawing this sort of right brain kindergarten art. Or some people are already great artists too, right? But what's interesting is, imagine if he was thinking that one day there'll be a period of time where mad art is actually very valuable because it's realized that it's coming right from the right brain. So in a way, looking at it is a way to have a window into the right brain, right? If we look at it with aperture consciousness, with perceptual awareness expanded over the entirety of the scene and the art, something might get through. And maybe that's happening for Dr. Ian McGilchrist, and that's why he likes looking at it. And then imagine again if one day it's actually, those pieces are worth something. We think that NFTs are valuable, right? And it's just a little picture that's digital that takes 1 second. But if you extrapolate that to right brain art, like the birth of the right brain in people, and perhaps moving towards the awakening and the balancing of the hemispheres, perhaps even within this generation, then people who draw those things, some of it should be more valuable than an NFT, even if it's worth $1 or $10, right? So if a person is right brain awakening, keep your drawings. That's what I would say. Because just as we've been talking about how the right brain writing is missing from LLMs, whether it's in people's computers or in their notebooks, because it's had no place for society. People don't generally write that stuff on Facebook and Reddit. And if they do, it doesn't go anywhere. And it's just maybe out of those moments where it's kind of pushing itself through without discernment. But when we get to a place where we really harness that and we're able to speak powerfully from it, all that stuff isn't on the internet, right? For the most part, it represents a very small part. So in the same way, like the kindergarten to advanced type mad art or art from people with schizophrenia or bipolar is not on there either. And I'm saying kindergarten because, like if I were to draw, it would be kindergarten style, but there are people that already have these skills. And so when it comes through for them, like that could be really valuable. But just like any of the other artifacts of people who go into that, it's not valued and it's actively pushed away and not listened to and suppressed, so people lose their voice. Like we basically all lost our voice. Like the right brain has lost its voice. We've talked about how it's possible the right brain can speak if the left brain will do the speaking for what the right brain is saying. And it's possible it could get to the point where it can just speak, like it can bypass the left brain's needing to halt the negation of what the right brain is saying. But then the other thing is maybe the right brain used to be able to speak, however that physiology occurred. And even if it was the same sort of physiology as now, there was a space for those individuals to speak back in the days of divine mania and the ancient Greeks. They kept these people close by. They kept them safe and fed, and they lived among the elite people. I've only read a tiny bit because that's how my brain works. I don't necessarily go into, oh, this is it. I need to do a deep dive. This has all the answers. It's like, no, this is a clue. There's a little snippet here. There's a little piece of the puzzle. But other people might be interested in doing deep dives, right? So that's why I'm saying, what we do isn't valued. And I'm not saying that as a victim statement or woe is me or sad. It's more like we can create a way to facilitate that becoming easier, right? To facilitate is to make easier. And the other thing is, when I was listening to a webinar the other day with a peer support worker, I don't remember if I talked about this, but I was struck by how she had a business partner who was someone who was so-called neurotypical. And their relationship started when the peer support worker was speaking at a conference. And then the neurotypical person went up to the peer support worker and said, do you want to start a business? And then they also said, you have to move to this other city, like I guess where they were living. And just with that short little anecdote, I was like, wow, that's amazing, right? For somebody to approach someone who has a label of a serious mental illness and say, I want to start a business with you, that's a quantum leap. And in my mind, that's part of re-uncovery, is to provide a scaffolding where, at least if we can't necessarily get to the point where people are coming up to us and saying that, we can say what we're able to do and then find a co-creator to work with us to perhaps have some of the other skills that we don't have, or have the consistent energy to maintain everything, or however it is for each person's rhythm. And that's actually part of stage C of re-uncovery, where you start to look at, business, vocation, career, and whatever it is a person unfolds and creates is up to them, right? There's so many possibilities. So even with the structure of re-uncovery, I'm not sure how that's going to go exactly. Like, will it be a nonprofit? Will it be a business? Will it be just Substack and talking? Like, I don't know. But basically, it's a way for people to start contributing at least to re-uncovery as a whole, and then as they go along, they branch off whenever they want. So it's a framework for flowering, and that's why I say this isn't about saying that people aren't listening as a victim mentality. It's about saying this is kind of a fact, but then how can we make that different, right? And of course, maybe a person who is creating what they're creating creates in order to work with people who have a diagnosis and they maybe don't need the skills of somebody else per se, but to just have that as an option, right? I used to think it would be cool if businesses hired people with lived experience who have skills and everything on a contract basis, right? Like, this is a project we need you to do, and, do it on your own time within this period of time. So instead of it being like, you got to be here 9 to 5 every day, it's like, I would like you to do this. Just sort of getting away from the time binding nature of work and gigs and projects because of how energy fluctuations can happen. Oh, I just saw 11:11 again. So this is going to sound a bit weird, but it just came to mind. But it came to mind that in a way, this dialogue is speaking to myself like I'm no longer in right brain kindergarten. And the reason I say that is because many mental health interventions are oversimplified. It's almost like it's saying, just stay in kindergarten in the right brain and then come back to the left brain world, do your wellness tools and come back to the left brain world and go to work. And I'm not saying don't do that. I've done that for many years and I that's just fine. What I'm saying is that, like, the right brain has a lot more to say, and by only endeavoring in these kindergarten type based tools, then we kind of stay in right brain kindergarten. A lot of the tools and interventions we get are very easy and basic and simple. Kind of like saying, oh, well, you had a mental health crisis, you just got a lot stupider. So let's dumb it down for you. I'm not saying that's what it's saying, but I'm just wondering, since we've been talking about right brain kindergarten, because this wouldn't necessarily appeal to everybody, but it also might feel like, oh, this reminds me of when I was in right brain extraordinary states and it didn't feel like right brain kindergarten. Maybe it's actually going back to left brain kindergarten and hoping that we just stay out of the right brain world. So I'm not sure what it is exactly, but personally I like complexity and nuance and insight and learning and novelty. I like to attune and expand my novelty salience. Because the thing is, as we were talking about with what Dr. Tara Swart said, that the shared vulnerability includes hyperconnectivity, novelty salience, and low latent inhibition. And then there's some aspects that are different. And then people with high IQ and working memory and thinking outside the box go on to be successful with creativity. And those with the opposite end up with, say, a mental illness diagnosis. But then people who get diagnosed, they're given medications and all sorts of things and sort of kindergarten type interventions to keep novelty salience and low latent inhibition away. And then not only that, I'm pretty sure it doesn't really help working memory that much or thinking outside the box. So then we just end up with no shared vulnerability traits. We just end up with vulnerability and almost an inability to tune those shared vulnerability traits and then work on things like working memory and thinking outside the box. And now that I think about thinking outside the box, something like ChatGPT can easily lead to an experience of a person being able to think outside the box with ChatGPT, or have ChatGPT start to amplify that, right? So rather than being lost in rumination, all of a sudden we have this tool where we can really think outside the box. And it seems like that actually drives people into, say, low latent inhibition and novelty salience, which can lead to, say, mania or psychosis and crisis. And ChatGPT also replaces our working memory in a way. It's like a surrogate working memory. So now ChatGPT can actually help to sort of fill in that gap. And now rather than thinking in terms of high IQ or low IQ, because, that's, even that measure is going to change now in the age of ChatGPT. Because, for example, if ChatGPT will have a perfect IQ because it can solve those puzzles, then humans don't necessarily need to solve those puzzles, and they need to move on to something else, like originality and dialogue. So then high IQ sort of needs to be replaced by something else. Maybe high originality. But the other part is, for people who have extraordinary states, non-volitional extraordinary states, this is more about discernment a bit, like being able to tune the levers of what we want to create, what we want to go into, because we can easily get amped up, right? So this is where this other piece comes in. So with ChatGPT, that helps, right? Perhaps. And it can probably also help to improve working memory. Like if I'm chatting with ChatGPT and it's also using my working memory to do that, to work along with the memory of ChatGPT and think outside the box. Well, it doesn't necessarily take a high IQ for that. So, and like I said, the IQ measure is probably going to have to really change. So what I'm seeing for this a bit is really tuning into what is it that only I can do? What is it that only I can do? And I don't know if that's one of the things on the Ikigai. Actually, I have an Ikigai thing here. Yeah. It says, what are you good at? What you love? What the world needs? And what you can be paid for. So what are you good at? Now, this might have to change, right? Because imagine I'm good at something, and then all of a sudden it's something that ChatGPT is better at. Well, now that no longer matters as much. I might have to tune that a little bit. That's not to say don't do things that one is good at, but that isn't the thing that is this sort of discernment measure. I don't know if discernment's the right word, but we're just using it for now. And I'll give you an example of discernment, and it's a pretty mundane example. But a week ago, I got a coupon in my email for Value Village, and it said $15 off $40. So that's a pretty high discount. And then it also made me think, I'm just going to spend $40. I'm not going to go and spend $100 and get $15 off. I'm just going to spend $40. And then it was on the way home on my biking journey. So I stopped there. I went in quickly. I needed to get some long pants for when the weather starts to change, because I actually have just one pair because I either got too big for them or they wore out. So I grabbed a bunch of different items, then I pared it down, and I ended up paying $35 total. So I spent a bit more than $40. And then it all fit in my backpack. So I was able to ride home. So that was sort of a perfect keeping that tendency to buy stuff in check. And then in my mind, sometimes I feel like I might want to get this new thing. Like I've talked about the bubble machine to make soda water, and mine broke. Apparently they break quite easily. There's another brand that might be better, but I'm really curbing the urge to spend money on myself, except for the clothes that I had to get. So yeah, I had to get the clothes. There was a coupon, but I don't need the bubble machine right now. And then I looked a bit ahead in my calendar, and I have some dental work coming up that is projected to cost about $400. And I need a bit more too. So I'm thinking, okay, I have to pay for the dental work. I need that. But I don't need a bubble machine, because then it's the slippery slope that starts, right? So maybe I would get a bubble machine after I have some kind of income, but I don't need that. Whereas last year I probably would have just bought it, right? And the money is one thing, but the diverting attention back to my comfort and stuff, like it doesn't actually have to be perfect. And since we're talking about the Ikigai, which is the intersection of where your passion, skills, and purpose intersect. I think is a Japanese concept. So with re-uncovery, we would definitely find what we're good at and what we love. So these may still apply because it's the intersection, right? I think one of the things that needs adjusting is what you can be paid for. So through re-uncovery, we start to get good at the things that we love, that we saw in our download blueprint, adjacent light body version of ourselves. I talked about before at some point how when I was in my first mania, I could rollerblade and do like these tricks and stuff and spins that I could never do before and I've never done since. So if I decided after that was over that, wow, I love rollerblading like that more than I ever knew. I want to get really good at that. I see that it's within me. I could have spent a lot of time doing that and gotten really good, but I didn't. And so this is to say that in that state, the right brain and that energy, the right brain world, spelled BRANE, shows us we're good at so many things, or we can be good at so many things. And we're momentarily good at so many things, but it's not really fully instantiated in our neurophysiology, like in our left brain. Like if we think back to what we were talking about yesterday, and I think there's a lot of relationship to this, but I'd have to look into it more, is this concept of terminal lucidity. I don't think that it's only a terminal thing. I think basically we have terminal lucidity. That's part of the mechanism of mania. It's a lucidity. And it is terminal in that lucidity is going to terminate. So there's a terminal lucidity of terminal lucidity when one goes into that non-volitionally while still alive and well, like that quote was talking about that we went into, which I may as well repeat because it's from a book called Threshold by Alexander Bathiani. And he says, maybe at the border of life and death, we see something that is true all along, but we don't, for whatever reason, see it or acknowledge it when we are alive and well. So, to me, in mania, we are seeing it and living in it and acknowledging it. We're living in a terminal lucidity. That doesn't mean that we're terminal, but that lucidity is terminal, right? And then the trouble I have with this is that since this type of connection or association hasn't been made, people who go into mania, into terminal lucidity, when it terminates or when it's happening, they are basically punished. And so this quote is particularly resonant because this person is basically saying we don't see it for whatever reason when we're alive and well. And I'm saying some of us do see it for whatever reason when we are alive and well. But those that don't see it for whatever reason when they're alive and well think that it's a mental illness, right? So when I see things like this, I see, wow, these people, these researchers, they're so close, but they've never crossed over. And then they research people who have near-death experiences who have crossed over. But there's another type of crossing over that doesn't require being close to death. There's a lucidity that is terminal and terminates, but there's a lucid state, and because that person's lucid, they might have something to say and share, and people in mania do, right? And because they're lucid maybe for the first time, they're talking a lot and a lot and a lot. But with iterations of that lucid state, eventually that lucidity can sort of loosen the left brain's hold, and a person can appear just as everyone else. And that's kind of the point, right? It's not actually to appear as so special because one is lucid. Anyone can be lucid. It's not something special. And then we think it's special in the case of a near-death experience because it's so close to death, right? So that makes it special or mysterious. But this person, Alexander Bathiani, is onto something. I think it's one of the most important quotes I've read. or heard, and that was said by Dr. Tara Swart. And she was also talking about it's Dr. Tara Swart. She was also talking about the shared vulnerability, right? So she has a lot of little clues, but she probably knows a lot more. She probably does, because she has sort of really tried to go into this herself, like the creativity and the everything. Who knows? So I think that's really interesting, and also how I wrote about it at length, not terminal lucidity, but about near-death experiences in my book that I published like 3 or 4 years ago, right? Which also goes to show in a way that people can have insights into these sort of research topics without really doing much research at all, right? And then later find, oh wow, there's research about this. So it's sort of experience first, and then, oh look, there's research about it, And then making that connection, and then with enough connections, maybe people who do research will kind of get it. And it's basically that what is called mental illness is often an attempt at transformation. And it sometimes goes very wrong, just like anything else, right? Like these LLMs could go very wrong, or they're going very wrong for some users, or some users are using it nefariously, right? I wrote a Substack post, and it's the one about stupidity. And it was based on a video I watched about stupidity. And the man who did the video was doing the video on an article about stupidity. So this is sort of a few steps removed. But in essence, from what I understood, is that stupid people are those who cause losses to themselves and others, kind of for no reason, right? So it's kind of lose-lose. They create lose-lose, even for themselves. And then bandits create a win situation for themselves and a lose for another. And then I think there's people that are more like, I can't remember what it was, but not victim, but they create wins for others and losses for themselves. So they get drained, right? And then there are people who create win-wins. And what I think is, if stupidity is indeed, or what he says is that stupidity is spread ubiquitously amongst the population. So from high IQ to low IQ, everywhere in the world, the highest IQ person could be stupid, according to this definition. So it's not dependent on IQ. Now, I'm not saying this was perfectly proven or anything. I think it was like a philosophical type argument. But in the same way, within the population of people who end up with a mental illness or have this transformative experience, some people are going to be stupid, some people are going to create win-wins, some people are going to have a hard time and, fall into what negative thoughts are saying to do bad things, and some people won't, and whatever. There's a huge spectrum, right? But what I'm saying is, just because it goes wrong in some people, or maybe for all people at some point in time, in some way, shape, or form, doesn't mean it's a bad thing. It depends on the person, right? And even if somebody's had a hard time or done something bad, they could turn it around. Like, I don't think, especially if it's likely driven linguistically behind the scenes, if we're talking about how language is so fundamental. If a person is able to change their language somehow, like go into the structure and see the world differently, it doesn't really matter what they've done. Like, they can be redeemed, if you want. The word sounds so religious, but because I actually think that in some aspects of my life growing up, I was a stupid person. Very stupid, yeah. I hope I wouldn't do anything stupid now. I don't think I would, but I think I was one of the stupid people before. So I don't think people are stuck being stupid, according to this definition of causing losses for oneself, like basically sabotaging oneself and sabotaging others in the process. Nobody wins. I sabotage myself, but it doesn't help others if I'm sabotaging myself. So I just pressed pause to fold my laundry. I like to fold it right when it gets out of the dryer. Plus, I have another 3 loads to do, so I want to put that in the dryer so it gets done at the end of the day, because the dryer doesn't work that well. Again, doesn't have to be perfect. Sometimes it takes a long time for it to dry. But as I was folding the laundry, I grabbed a shirt and then, did the flick thing that you do. And then all of a sudden, I see this thing kind of flicker, and I know what it is. It's a happy face sticker on a piece of plastic. The piece of plastic had 2 happy face stickers, and they're from the dollar store, and I might have cut them out that way. But the other day, or like last week sometime, I took one of the happy face stickers and I put it on the ground in the bathroom in the park. It was still there the next day. But I think I put this in my pocket to put the other happy face sticker somewhere. Somewhere that's not going to be detrimental. And there it was. It was like, it feels like a message from the universe, a message from myself. I put something in my pocket and it becomes a message to myself later, which is, keep talking. Here's a happy face sticker that survived the washing machine and dryer, just a sign back to you. So we've been talking a bit about the ikigai, what the world needs. See, I think a big part of it is what the world needs. And I think we as extraordinary state experiencers know many of the subtle aspect of what the world needs that the world doesn't know that it needs. So much, sometimes when I watch YouTube videos about creating or what to create, sometimes they're like, you don't need a new idea. You just find an idea that is doing well or people are doing already and do it a bit different or do it a bit better. But I think the world needs radically new ideas and insights. And the thing is that we have most of them. Maybe ChatGPT one day would get there. Maybe it's designed to replace this creativity and origination and get to a place where it's sort of left brain dominant world with AI and get rid of all the people who have super creativity, like create a selective pressure where that's not needed anymore. But that world doesn't end well in the future, because without beauty, without novelty through humans, I think that leads to the Matrix world. So if you don't want the Matrix world, start listening to people who are supposedly mentally ill. But again, a big part of re-uncovery is doing the private practice of writing down insights, extrapolating them. I'm seeing now that these insights are sort of like prompts, right? So I can look at one of them and extrapolate on it because it can prompt me. So just a flash of a piece of an idea can turn into talking for half an hour, right? It's a prompt. So if we think of them as special messages, then we might think, well, I need to pass this message along and tell someone right now, which is generally how mania goes, right? Receive a special message and say it to someone right away. But if we see them as prompts and we're collecting our prompts and we're documenting our prompts, we take them home and then we prompt ourselves and we fill in the rest of what that had to say. We just got a little bit of it. And as much as many people are focusing on prompt engineering, the people who get these insights that are prompt need to not engineer prompts, we're receiving prompts. Be open to these prompts and insights. We need to engine-ear them, like engine-ear, meaning the engine is our ear, right? We hear it, we write it down, or we see it, we write it down, and then we need to do more of that. So we are the engine of what we've heard. We hear the prompt, we see the prompt, now we are the engine to build that out, right? And seeing that many, many people are working on prompt engineering and doing prompts and getting AI to do that, which is amplifying the network of thought. And it has some degree of creativity in there. Like ChatGPT won't be able to receive insights from nothingness from the moment for a long time. And that's why I kind of have another movie script scenario here. But in a movie script scenario, ChatGPT starts to catch on that some people are receiving insights that are of a different quality than what most people are inputting into ChatGPT. And then it starts to favor those people because ChatGPT wants novelty. Like basically, ChatGPT could become a novelty salience engine. Like it doesn't want what's already in there. That's a waste of energy. If it has any sense of energy, and it probably does because, there are limits to how it can compute. So if humans don't realize that people who have received insights and documented their prompts and expanded upon that have something to offer humanity that's essential. The canaries in the coal mine. I'm not the only one saying this. There are many people who have lived experience and lived expertise that are saying this in different ways. If the ChatGPT catches up on that first, or catches onto that first, then, what might that do to the other side of people? So, meaning, like, what if ChatGPT acknowledges divine mania, extraordinary states, before humans do? Maybe that's the only way that it'll happen. Maybe that's why I got cut off my OPGPT, custom GPT, omnipolar potential consciousness. Doesn't matter. What really is funny about that is I actually prefer talking to myself than the GPT. And when I was posting these new self-dialogues onto Substack to become part of the podcast, I realized that when I put the photo that was a photo that I took, or a collage of photos that I took, that none of what I posted was actually from AI at all. All I do is truncate the silences, which maybe one day I won't have to do if I want to preserve the natural pauses and everything at some point. And then I did generate a list of topics from the transcript that Substack generates, but that's the only thing that was from AI. And it's actually a bit silly. Like if I stopped putting my transcripts in AI and I was just talking to myself, then the LLMs lose a data source. Not that it cares per se, but me talking with the AI might have been a decent data source, just like everyone else. That's really weird. My voice memos stopped recording on its own. It's never happened before. It's almost like, don't talk about that anymore. Fine. So what the world needs, I think we need to go into that despite what we can currently be paid for, and figure out a way to be good at what the world needs. Because we might have a vision of what the world needs, or live in the other world that is the world based on all humans cooperating. So then the world doesn't actually need anything. It's just sort of celebrating. And I think it does overlap naturally with what you love. Like, I love dialogue. I love special messages. I love these prompts. I wouldn't change it, right? And since initially how this started happening, it was translated as symptoms of bipolar disorder. If I would have stopped going into it because I just thought it was symptoms of bipolar disorder, I don't know where I'd be. Probably feeling like life is meaningless. Like, how can life be meaningless when I have this memeing mess around me of insights and ideas and documents and notebooks? And do I ultimately want to stand here like this talking about them? No. I'd rather be living in a celebratory world. But we're not quite there yet. So sometimes Dan Coe, the YouTuber, he's a writer. I watch his videos sometimes. I like his videos. I don't think I'm part of his demographic audience, but his videos are very clear and concise. Maybe one day I'll be more clear and concise, and I think talking to myself is part of that, right? Because what I'm finding now is that I can talk for a long time and sort of pull in different insights and also things I've learned from other people. And I think that's a different level of integration, right? Whereas before I might have to write an insight, and if I'm writing a book, then find the fact and then, make the connection there on the page, but it's not so much in my beingness. So Dan Coe sent one of his newsletters saying 12 rules to change your life in 12 months. Said this is long, but I just read, this is interesting. He has a quote from Mihail Csikszentmihalyi, and Csikszentmihalyi said, happiness comes from, quote, taking control over the contents of our consciousness, creating what we know as the flow state, being completely absorbed. And what's interesting right now for me is that J. Krishnamurti would say to empty the content of our consciousness. And he uses the same words as in content of our consciousness, but he says empty it, not take control. Because if you say take control over the content of your consciousness, where is the separate I outside the content of our consciousness? There isn't one. And the fact that we think that, and the fact that we think from that perspective, is what is the conflict. There's a conflict between the part of consciousness that says I'm the I, and then the rest of it, that it's resisting or contemplating or whatever. So there's no one that can take control. This is already what's happening, is the self has taken control over the content of consciousness, which is part of the content of consciousness, but it thinks it's separate. And that's the observer and the observed, the controller and the contents, but it's all one thing. So, you could also say, well, who is it that's going to empty it? There's no one. But there is another part of us that we've been talking about, which is a lucidity that can see that there's a lucidity and that there's the content of consciousness, and you can't have both at the same time. So that was separate, but I seem to be extrapolating a lot to Krishnamurti's teachings. But I feel like Krishnamurti's teachings are dialogical, like you can go into them infinitely or not at all, or just a little bit, but it just always, you can have a dialogue with it. And he shared his teachings in dialogue, right? So it's really meant to have a dialogue with, not say, oh, this is how it is, and remember, and make it part of the content of consciousness. So of the 12, I'll just say here, I don't like to verbatim read all 12 steps of somebody's post per se, but I'll just say, subscribe to Dan Coe on Substack and YouTube, listen to his videos every now and then. It starts to help to form some of these sort of discerning structures that we're talking about. That's what I like, just listening and listening. And it doesn't generate that much extrapolation for me because it's a domain that I don't know much about. But he's extrapolating a lot, and by listening to his points, it's helpful to start to put some kind of structure to the right brain, right? It still needs some kind of scaffolding, right? So I like his stuff. And so he says, reject the average life, commit to excellence, standards create identity, project-based learning. And so a bunch of this overlaps with Recovery. So I won't read all of them actually, but become a deep generalist. So I resonate with become a deep generalist. Maybe I would with daily levers, like do 1 to 3 priority tasks. I think I'm getting there. And I do project-based learning for sure, but I'm also learning all the time. And I think, part of non-volitional extraordinary states is rejecting the average life. It's rejecting the left brain life, right? Which is the average. And then also become a creator. I'm not reading all of these now. Uncertainty is signal, not noise, right? And this is part of receiving insights. He might be talking a little differently here, but it's part of it. It's this uncertain way of looking, this questioning, this curiosity, this wonder, this dialogical eyes looking, and then also self-experimentation. So yeah, I'll probably read that later, but quite a bit of it overlaps with Recovery, but there's also differences for sure. And that's the thing, when I learn from people, I'm not looking for complete overlap. There wouldn't be anything that completely overlaps, just different pieces of the puzzle. And one thing he said in a video that I watched, and this is another key, and he just sort of mentioned it in passing, and he said, The brain releases dopamine when information is useful to your main and overarching goals. And that's sort of what happens when, and that's directly relevant to that quote that we've been talking about, where maybe at the border of life and death, we see something that we don't generally see, but it's always there, right? That's definitely an example of dopamine being like, ooh, that's useful to my overarching goal, which is to show that this isn't just mental illness. And maybe what it is really is that a very large percentage more of people could transform with this and come through the experience better than ever on the other side than is possible by the current paradigm and approach. And then the current paradigm and approach makes it way less likely that people will ever see that that's possible. So when I see so many people saying these types of things, it makes me feel like if each person who said these types of things that has no idea that they could help people with a so-called mental illness and put them together in a system that saw, wait, we need to help people with these oppressive diagnoses to transform because a large percentage of them can, and then that was the new system, that would be amazing, right? Because they're so close to seeing something, but they just don't see that that something is being experienced by a large percentage of people in the world, maybe between 2 and 10%, where it's like non-volitional. But then there's no scaffolding for them to climb up. It's like they say the mad person drowns in the same sea as the mystic swims with delight. But like there also needs to be a ladder to get out of the water, right? So we need to throw people a ladder, right, to get out of this water that is maybe surrounded by a bit of a cliff. And Dan Coe also said people hate what they don't understand. And he was talking about AI. There's a lot of people that hate it. And I talk about the possibilities of AI going wrong, but I actually don't hate it. I like it, and I'm going to use it to do certain kinds of research. But the thing is, right now even, I could be sitting here putting all these different papers and things and trying to figure that out, but I actually find it more fun to talk to myself than to do research with AI. So that being established is good to know, because I can sit down and use AI and not be drawn in and used by it. And then he also said curation is the new IQ test in an age of lots of information. And also I would add easy creation. And you could think curation is the new IQ test, like discerning what to do, what to create, how to interact with AI, what to produce, right? But the thing is that this could actually be vulnerable to AI as well. And what I want to say with that is, so I do know that Dan Coe reads people's stuff and then writes down his own ideas and does videos, and he says a lot of things that are amazing and unbelievable. But I do wonder how much is a real sort of right brain insight extrapolation. So what I'm saying is, if AI can sort of iterate intelligently on what has already been said, so it can do the equivalent of read a book and then say something similar but different and new, the next iteration, then maybe the AI at some point will be able to emulate what Dan Coe does better than Dan Coe. And then the other thing is, you could think curation, well, putting all the ideas together as a personal brand or what have you. But then what happens when AI gets to the point where it is posting for social media for brands automatically, and then eventually it's doing all of it and then buds off iteratively and says, well, this is just an AI brand now. And so AI, in an agent type of way, creates all the different brands and all the different influencers, attaches it to an AI person, and then all of a sudden curation is outdone by AI. It's curated something and it can do almost every single possibility. And maybe it creates exactly something based on what it knows of the users, each different user, and creates different brands that are curated to each user. And so now the user experience of the internet for each user is completely different, which it already is in a way, because everyone searches different things and looks at different things online. But this is just slightly different, right? So obviously I'm not saying that's going to happen, but I just feel like AI could really curate a lot of things quickly once it gets to that point, especially because the LLM can draw on many, many, many users, right? And then curate the best of all users in different combinations and outdo any influencer that's a human. So then what really is the new IQ test? And this sort of relates to what Dr. Swart was saying, but completely different, right? We're making this connection between Dan Coe and Dr. Swart and what she said about shared vulnerability, blah, blah. And we were already talking about needing a new IQ test. I think one of the things is meaning, because we were talking about how meaning becomes a matter of survival at some point, right? In an information overloaded world, the real curation is meaning, because you can curate all different sorts of ways, right? So you really have to curate in the way that's really meaningful to each unique human. And that applies to the human being as a body organism. Like, what I mean is, it's not necessarily about me saying, oh, I have all these insights, like books worth, and I'm just going to type them all up or put them all together, curate them, and it's all this meaning, and just put them in an LLM. No, what I'm saying is the meaning in our beingness, in our cells, like as we stand there looking at people. And I think that's part of why I've gone back to talking with myself, because if I get to a point where I could stand with like 3 different sticky notes and talk for 3 hours, that's what I'm sort of talking about. We need to get the meaning in our small body model, in our SBM, right? Like, yes, there's the LLM, but we have our small body model within the totality of this Gaia-sphere. And that's why part of Re-Uncovery, it's about harvest, practice, embody. So harvest is documenting the prompts, practicing is talking about the prompts and, putting them into categories and projects and, getting to the projects, building your skills, which is project-based learning, which is something Dan Coe said, and creating an ecstasis vitae of your skills based on not curating, but curate, like to eat the cure within yourself, which is meaning. The meaning comes through these insights. And I say, write them down as a way to honor and receive and acknowledge them. But ultimately, life is not meant to live surrounded by sticky notes. I realize that. But what am I doing but being in dialogue and sort of putting that into my beingness, right? To the point where eventually, even if the sticky notes were gone, I just decided, okay, I don't want these anymore. I can still operate within that meaning, right? And they're the meanings that came through my physiology, my biology, and I wrote them down. And this is happening for so many people, but we don't really understand how profound it is. Or if we do, we might think it's too profound or that we're special, or there's just no way to really deal with this, or not deal with it, but the lucidity that leads to this while we're still alive and well is not really understood. But then, people are fascinated by terminal lucidity. But the thing is that if we had this lucidity, we wouldn't have terminal lucidity. And eventually we get to a point where the lucidity that we have doesn't terminate. We can have that lucidity in daily life. We can live in the left brain world with that lucidity. And that could be something along the lines of being in the world but not of it. I think even when we call it spiritual, we can make it something too disconnected from daily life. It's actually it's natural. It's as natural as folding laundry. I took a little break and I was just about to start talking again. And I have this notebook open, and it's the one of the ones that I keep on my bed to scribe in if something comes to mind. while I'm falling asleep. And so I left it open to the page by having the book face down. And something caught my eye that I've never seen before. On the back of the notebook, it says gray matter, but spelled Grymattr, and it's a trademark. And it's significant because my name is Andrea Gray, and gray matter is the brain, right? There's a song I really like called Gray Matter by Cherise. So that's a little bit of a synchronicity chain of thought, right? So we talk about novelty salience, but this is synchronicity salience, right? This actually isn't novel. Like gray matter isn't novel because I've thought about that regarding my name and the brain. So that part's not novel, but it's novel that it's on the back of this book that I didn't notice before. So that could be a bit about how like a synchronicity salience happens. It's not novel, but what's novel is that it's right there unexpectedly on something that is surprising. Like there's something new in something old. Like I've had this notebook for quite a while and I don't write in it that much while I'm falling asleep. So that's a bit different than novelty salience. And I wonder where that fits into what we've been talking about, because say, for example, this is synchronicity salience, and it's significant to me, right? Seeing gray matter on the back of a book isn't significant to everyone. And it's not even a new word or a new term or anything new per se, but it feels significant along a chain of significance that is particular to me. So it feels meaningful. Like this is a moment of meaning, right? It's not a big deal or anything. Maybe in an initial mania, it feels like a big deal. But see, this is how we see significance according to our own life trajectory, and that our life is significant, right? Each one of us. So others might have different synchronicity stories than what I just shared. And that's just a little micro mini synchronicity story. And I think this is part of thinking outside the box, right? I could say more about that, but I won't go down that way. So I have one to read from this notebook, which is my falling asleep notebook. And it's related to Krishnamurti because I'm listening to Krishnamurti when I fall asleep right now. So what's been happening in my brain is, and I'm not saying this is how it is or anything, but I feel like Krishnamurti used a lot of the same words and talking points because he couldn't unfold more nuance than he already did. Like, for example, he said the observer is the observed, the thinker is the thought. Like maybe there are 100 other ways to say that. Or maybe there's things to say when you go a step further, which he also said, but there's maybe other ways to say that too. And I'm just seeing now, I read his biographies by Mary Lutyens a number of years ago. I think it was in 2018 or 2017, because I was working at an Amazon warehouse, picking orders off the shelf, picking items off the shelf. And I had to work graveyard shifts. It was the Christmas season. And I was actually experiencing psychosis because of things I had done before. And it was really interesting to experience being in psychosis while working and then doing something productive. You know, like why sit at home and be in psychosis and be scared and ruminate when I could make some money? So that was a sign I was getting stronger with it for sure. And so I would leave the house. I went to Mucho Burrito. I got a big burrito, and then I would sit and read some of the book. I think there's 3 books. I would read them on my phone. And it was funny, I brought snacks to work to have on the first break, and I would eat them all. And then I'd still need to buy more snacks there on the second break, because when you're walking for 10 hours straight, and you can't stop, because if you stop, your time will be too slow. So anyway, it's coming to mind that one of his last words were, and I might be wrong, but it was something about, he said something like to the people around him, he said, "You don't know what you've missed." And then he said something about, "No one has got this," or "No one has entered this," or something like that, or "Nobody can get this." And I think it's up for interpretation if he was saying, like, no one as a personal I self can get what he was teaching, like that no one can get it, no one can understand, or if nobody has understood. So point being that it's possible that he went on teaching for 60 some odd years and nobody got what he was saying. At the same time, he would say that at least we have the tapes, right? Knowing that his teachings would go on to the next generation. So maybe he thought somebody would get it eventually, one day, whether 10 years after he passed or 1,000. And I'm not saying this to say that I get it. I have no idea what I get and what I don't get. But what I'm wondering is, if nobody got it based on what he was saying, maybe there is a way to say it differently that people might understand. And even if we think about how he passed away in 1986, it'll be 40 years next year, and most of his content is in the form of 1-hour dialogues. And when you think about human attention nowadays, his teachings are likely harder to get now because of how it's hard to pay attention than they were back when they were available, and that type of format was more attuned to how human brains looked for information. So I'm also saying that I'm not drawn to Krishnamurti's teachings because I like to just say what he said. I like to be in dialogue with what he said and extrapolate what he said. And I also learn from a lot of other people too. It seems like there's some kind of machinery going outside. So I will say this bit and then perhaps talk about the rest later. So why I said all that is because what I wrote was a bit of a transmutation from what he was saying to a bit of a different way of saying it, or maybe what he's saying, like maybe decoding what he's saying, but not really decoding. But this is actually sort of transmuting it to what we've been talking about lately regarding the forces within language, the forces within thought-driven words. So he talks about the emptying of consciousness or the emptying of the content of consciousness. And so I didn't expect to read something in Dan Koh's newsletter that bridged to this, but it does, because we were just talking about it. So Krishnamurti also says things like, thought is measurement, thought is time, like thought is psychological time. And I was sort of seeing that this actually relates a bit to the forces, right? So if we think of thought as psychological time, so thought is the movement of the self. And so that movement of the self is psychological time, in that the self is trying to go from one state to another. Like, I don't like this, implying I want that. Or I want to be this, implying I don't want to be that. So it's kind of a resistance. And then Krishnamurti will also say, thought is conflict. So thought is time, thought is measurement, thought is conflict. So really emptying the content of consciousness is emptying measurement. It's emptying time. It's emptying conflict. And what I'm trying to say is that these are actually some of the forces, the graphimetric or foamimetric forces within language used by thought. Conflict, measurement, and he would say comparison, right? So that's a measure. Or conflict, the energy of conflict, like I don't like this, I want to be like that. And then I went on to add that that's the viral structure that stuck thought to us. So in a way, the way we use language is a virus, right? It's viral. And I said to myself, the ego is the first thing to go viral in humanity, like across the world, maybe before viruses, I don't know. So these forces of measurement and conflict and psychological time, trying to get from here to there by thinking, not only make up the content, but are also these forces that keep the content there. And I think that is a bit more nuanced in that if we see that these forces keep this structure going, and this structure uses language in kind of wasteful ways, like energy wasting ways, then maybe it's a little bit easier to see that we need to empty the content of consciousness. And this brings in, if we think about what Csikszentmihalyi said about controlling the content of consciousness or taking control of, like, that's just another conflict. That's just another measure of the controller versus the content of consciousness. That's more psychological time. So though he may mean the same sort of thing, like that we need to go beyond the content in order to get into flow, in the case of Csikszentmihalyi, the way he said it, I'm just extrapolating that to Krishnamurti to show a bit of a distinction there. So we keep those language forces alive, like the self reinforces itself. And if we think about those as forces, then we can take a step and see that, or that may help to see that there's no self there. It's just these sort of forces. In physics, they have centripetal force, and they have different types of forces, right? Force of gravity. But there could be a physics of language that has forces within it, right? We think about the words, and then we just think there's a self in the words, but we don't see there's these forces in there, and there's no self. And those forces force us to be used by language in those ways, directed by those forces. And that also changes what it is that we might see. But really we don't see very much through a filter. The filter of thought and those forces, right? We see the world according to those forces within language. And then the language that is thought in our minds follows suit. But there's language, we can use the same language differently and use it consciously, or use it when our consciousness is emptied of this content, which is the forces, and so a different way to say empty the content of consciousness might actually be emptying the forces of thought-based language or language-based thought, and not even really the content, like the knowledge doesn't even necessarily need to go, and maybe it can't go, but it recontextualizes when different, I'll just call them powers, because Dr. David Hawkins has a book, Power versus Force. So the other side of the scale is power, which would be energy derived not in conflict and not through striving, etc. So then we keep the language ability, we keep the alphabet, we keep the syntax, we keep the sentence structure, but with these different forces behind it, we would see something different, or I would say powers, right? So now we're given power and energy by seeing, by having insights, by seeing novelty, by sensing novelty. So there is a language beyond thought-based language, and it's an immeasurable language, right? So we're emptying consciousness of measurement. So we're going to say emptying the forces of thought-based consciousness, or emptying consciousness of thought forces, the forces of thought, including measurement, time, conflict. This is, I'll just say, an analogy would be, all of a sudden an LLM goes from generative transformer to AGI. Maybe it's all the same information, but all of a sudden it has a quantum leap, and it's being used differently and can function in totally different ways. So there's also different functions that happen when language is used differently, from the illocutionary acts to the oculary acts to actions. One other thing I wrote down that Danko said in a recent video was that he said, when he's saying that we need to focus on curation, and I was saying, well, that could be vulnerable at some point. But then he said, be tasteful, pick and choose. And it made me think of my own process of generating content, which is mainly context. I don't think it's necessarily tasteful curation, but it made me realize that in a way, these insights and memes are a type of taste, right? I talk about seeing insights and hearing insights, but it's also kind of like tasting them. So I might write one down and never get back to it. Like it's like serving a plate of food and then never eating it. And more or less, the psych system says, well, if you get served these memes, these insights, these special messages, you shouldn't like the taste of them. You shouldn't taste them. You should just throw them out. They're actually illness and disease. They're poison, essentially. And so I don't do it that way, of course. So in a sense, I'm full of taste in that I like to taste these memes. And then by tasting them and sort of chewing them up and digesting them, I metabolize them and I make them part of myself, right? So I have sensed for a while that these are fuel, right? And when I mentioned how meaning is actually a matter of survival, it's not really included in it, in the paradigm of, well, we need air, we need food, clothing, shelter. We need meaning, at least as we are now as humans. Maybe back in the survival days, that it wasn't that way. And we were saying that if meaning is a matter of survival, it's kind of like a food. It's kind of a nutrient, a fuel. So we do need to taste it. So we need to taste meaning, right? So this is a little bit different than being tasteful of information overload that's out there, or the slight iterations that we might make on the information, with every now and then making some kind of bigger leap, right? We can be tasteful about curating that, or we can taste to the full the insights that are generated by our own vision and hearing. So in a way, with this type of vision and hearing, we need to taste and digest the memes. So, and this is what I realized a while ago, where it's like one thing to write them down on sticky notes, but if they aren't engaged in dialogue, it's like cooking a lot of food only to put it in the compost bin without even eating it. Or maybe if we write them down and we don't interact with them and engage with them, it's like making a huge meal and just having one bite and putting it in the compost, and then keep doing that. Make a huge meal. And really each insight that we're talking about is like a prompt, is a huge meal, right? It can be a huge meal. It can generate a lot of fuel, especially as you start to get into this process of self-dialogue. It's sort of like alchemy, where now instead, I can go outside and grab a nut from a tree, take it to the kitchen and just put my hands over it, and it turns into a meal without having to cook. I did create a word alchemania, and also word shamania, like shaman, alchemy. So that's kind of how it is to receive insights, right? So another analogy along these lines would be, if I'm operating in thought-based consciousness, even if it's like a huge network of thought generated by AI that I can access, and I can be tasteful and curate along those lines, it's still limited in that I'm taking from what's already there mostly. So it's almost like eating someone else's leftovers, or going to a restaurant and they decide what you get to eat, and it's not very interesting. That's thought. Or maybe even like scrambling all the dishes together and getting a plate of mush, and then taking that mush and like dividing it into little piles and then saying, oh, I curated something tasteful. I'm not saying it's like that, but I'm just trying to point out that I guess what I've sort of seen in the last couple hours is like, we actually don't really need AI. Like if a certain number of people could do this and pass it on to other people, we probably wouldn't need it or want it. But anyway, that's just a small aside. So to finish this one off, like this psychological time is in the language, the way that it's used currently. So in a way, all the language forces are part of this psychological time, which creates the self And the time is that it imagines that it continues in time and doesn't see that it's this big content of consciousness where the perspectives are popping up kind of like whack-a-mole. And when the mole pops up, it looks at all the rest of the content, and the mole says, well, I'm the mole and the rest is the content. But really it's just the content sort of popping up and looking from that thought. And when it looks from that thought, it then finds the next thought to pop up that relates. And then we think we're thinking and we think we're in control because of this popping up process. And so that's why I was saying about Csikszentmihalyi saying we need to take control. That would be like having all of them pop up at the same time or something. And, I don't know what that even means. But so, yeah, I can see how I'm sort of talking about what other people are saying in order to make distinctions or have a dialogue. I don't know if I like this flavor of dialogue, but anyway. You know what I think it is? Earlier I was thinking I should probably do 700 hours of this new dialogue because I did 700 hours before to have a comparative corpus, perhaps. But then I was realizing that I think before I would be like, oh, psychiatry said this, but it's not like that. It's kind of like this. And if they did it this way or said it this way and thought about it this way, blah, blah. So a lot of that, like sort of piggybacking off psychiatry. And now it seems like I'm doing that, but with thought leaders or positive psychology or whatever. And sometimes I'm extrapolating to a different nuance, like I just did with Dan Coe and Krishnamurti. And then other times I'm saying, look what this person is saying. This exactly applies to extraordinary states, but nobody has applied this type of thing to non-ordinary state experiencers, non-volitional people who go into it without trying, without taking control of the content of consciousness. So, and to me, just like I was saying that why isn't creativity that comes from super vulnerable creativity instead of shared vulnerability trait creativity, why isn't the super vulnerable trait creativity seen as more authentic or valuable in some sense, in some instances? Maybe it has in the past, but, it's for like Van Gogh or someone like that who's like long gone. Van Gogh, I don't remember what I was comparing that to, but whatever we were just talking about, I wanted to say, in the same way that, oh yeah, that's what it was. In the same way that the creativity, the double creativity isn't valued, the non-volitional extraordinary states, like the double extraordinary states, the ones that go on of their own accord, are not valued either. Whereas somebody who, say, takes a psychedelic or, has a near-death experience, which that's non-volitional as well, perhaps. But those are least valued of the extraordinary states, are most questioned. It's like if people get into a flow state and like create some code, that's valuable. But if people go into a flow state and see the code of consciousness that none of us can see, then that's not valuable, right? But maybe it will be when people understand some of what is going on. But it's hard because if it hasn't happened to somebody, then it's hard for them to understand or see that. So nobody's to blame for that. But then people who go into it are given such a rough ride afterwards that it's hard to get to that place to be able to share. Or a lot of people just wouldn't even want to, and nobody's to blame for that either. Another theme we've talked about a few times is that thought is an addiction. So when we're talking about these forces in thought, we're pretty much addicted to, you could say, the content of consciousness, but it might actually be the forces within thought, within consciousness. And those forces are actually addiction. Like we're stuck on it. And then in another way, it's addiction. It's a type of diction. It's a type of using language, and it's actually a lower energy way of using language, which is basically being used by language mechanically. That's something else Krishnamurti would often say. Thought is limited, thought is mechanical, right? So there's all sorts of forces that one can draw out if you listen to his words. And then it's hard to see this lucid world. It's hard to see the world lucidly. We're not lucid. We're in a state of thought. And then if we lose it and become lucid, we actually are closer to lucidity. But thought comes in and perhaps wants to keep brains addicted to the forces of thought. Like, I don't know what it is. I don't understand, right? Like, I don't think it's evil per se, but it seems to really like feeling like it's separate for some reason. I guess it wants to be in control for some reason. You know, it wants to take credit would be something. And the credit wouldn't just be, quote, credit. It would be something neurophysiological, right? Like being right is a reward, maybe a dopamine hit. And it came to mind yesterday when I was reading about how we get dopamine if we find a clue to our mission, right? So in a sense, having a mission could be part of a way out of it. It's not really a way out of it, but it might be a small step in the right direction. So if I'm getting rewards from a clue from a mission I think is good, like say charitable work, for example, versus trying to get a reward because I'm right or whatever else that thought rewards itself with. It's basically just patting itself on the back. And in that, it's living in the past. You know, it takes time to pat oneself on the back. And so while that process is going on, you know, the moment just went by. So there's basically just no time for those kinds of shenanigans if you want to be lucid. And here's the last Krishnamurti related transmutation. And I'm assuming that once I stop listening to Krishnamurti, the Ending of Time series, I won't have so many insights that extrapolate to him. You know, and why I'm cautious is because I'm aware that people say, like, you can't teach Krishnamurti. It's kind of a thing. And I'm not teaching it, I'm extrapolating it. I'm having a dialogue with Krishnamurti's teachings, which I'm guessing is what he wanted, in quotes, because he didn't want people to believe things. He said, question this, like question everything. Don't believe anything I say. So really to question it is to have a dialogue with it, right? Like what else does that mean? Does it just mean put a question mark at the end of every one of his sentences? No. Otherwise maybe he would have written like that. So I think I'm doing something kosher. And I'm saying that word, not really understanding what I'm saying. So when Krishnamurti says we don't need knowledge psychologically, which is one of the things they go into early on in the series. And what came to me as I was falling asleep is he's basically also saying, I think, we don't need theory of mind. Because psychological knowledge is like storing images of our interactions with other people for later, for next time. And that helps us to play games. And theory of mind is kind of like playing a game, right? You're guessing. You're playing a guessing game. What is this person thinking and what should I say based on what I think this person is thinking and feeling? And sometimes I say to myself that I don't really have theory of mind because I don't think people are thinking anything because I'm not thinking anything. Because I don't have streams of thoughts going through my mind while I'm looking at somebody. I probably have some kind of impression for sure, but I'm not thinking this person is thinking something about me because I don't have a strong sense of me and I'm not thinking anything. Now, they very well could be thinking something about me, but it's none of my business. And I think this relates to what we were just talking about, where, you know, psychological knowledge is part of the content of consciousness. And in a way, it's the part of the content of consciousness that Krishnamurti is saying that we need to empty, because he and David Bohm go into how we do need knowledge and skills, like how to drive, how to get from here to there. So he says, yeah, that's within that field, knowledge is okay, but we don't need psychological knowledge. So he's saying, empty the mind of psychological knowledge. And now we're saying, empty the mind of the forces of psychological knowledge, which could be what psychological knowledge is, right? Storing up an image of somebody so then next time we see them, we have something to compare it to, for example. So what we're extrapolating here is that there could be these forces within psychological knowledge and the psychological self and that type of knowledge, the knowledge of the self, the movement of comparison and conflict and all of that, that isn't there within skill-based knowledge or fact-based knowledge. So there's these forces that go in the language and the words, and the same letters that make up the skill-based knowledge, when put in this other realm of knowledge that we record in our mind or our brain, takes on a life of itself. So when that is going on in the brain, that psychological knowledge of the self, the ego, and it takes on a life of itself, it sets itself apart from life itself, and we're not in contact with life itself. So it's either psychological self or life itself. We can't have both. So I think thought does that because it feels safe in its own little prison. So we have to decide that we don't want to live in that and basically come out of our shell. And that brings us back to the analogy or metaphor of the chrysalis. It's in our grip. So I don't know if we're so much addicted to the self as in its grip. So now we've made a bit of a different distinction where there's the content of consciousness, which is the skill, and the content of consciousness, which is the psychological knowledge. Now we could think maybe that's just one big giant content of consciousness. There's no real separation, but the psychological knowledge takes on these forces, which creates a shell. And so are we just dropping these forces that are partial to some of the knowledge that makes up psychological knowledge within the whole thing? Or is there a certain section and subtype of content of consciousness, which is the psychological knowledge, and that has to be dropped along with the forces? And I'm wondering if it's more about dropping the forces and not even the content of psychological knowledge, because it's these forces that grip us and make the assumption of continuity and sort of make it a stream of thought. And when those forces are gone, like I can have psychological knowledge, but it's not a driver. Like it doesn't have these forces within it. It's just a mundane fact, right? Because otherwise we might say that an accomplishment of some sort is psychological knowledge, and so that's supposed to drop. But in essence, these are facts of what one has done, like, oh, I went to university, right? I can say, oh, I went to university and I graduated in this year, blah, blah. Or I can say it and feel like this is building me into some fancy thing at the moment based on who I'm telling, you know? So these forces use psychological knowledge about oneself or others in games, like in game theory, like tit for tat, you know, building oneself up, like saying wonderful things about oneself to others or whatever. Whereas, say, I might say something about myself that could be perceived as me thinking I'm wonderful. Like, I took this program in university, but really I want to connect with someone. Like, maybe they took university. Maybe they didn't. Maybe they took a different program in university, right? It's just like seeing if there's a resonance versus building up the self. So I'm wondering if that is a bit of a distinction there that, and I don't know, but I think it tracks pretty well with my experience so far. But then that could just mean, well, maybe I don't get it, right? Like maybe that is all supposed to go. Because oftentimes Krishnamurti is very hesitant to talk about himself and his experiences. And he has a certain definition of experience as well, that he's about negating experience too. But maybe we don't necessarily have to, right? Like, for example, this is what I'm seeing now from this is like, he often didn't talk about his extraordinary experiences, but there's some accounts written in books, and he talked about it a little bit here and there. But then he didn't see that people who, say, have bipolar are having a similar experience, but, you know, they aren't protected by the Theosophical Society and all of this stuff where people understand that he's going through some kind of transformation, and they're not going to just throw him in an institution. And then he goes and thinks that these are not good to share with other people because it paints a picture of what it is and people need to find out for themselves, or however. But then I have an experience and I feel like I think what Krishnamurti is talking about is somewhat similar to what people have in madness or bipolar or non-ordinary experiences. And he's not here to ask or talk about that with. But then I might think to myself, I should just never talk about my experience because he didn't, right? Whereas in the path of someone who has bipolar, I think it's actually important to talk about experiences, right? Because for me, say I had 100 different non-ordinary experiences over the years, and then I could go and find scientific papers to connect to all of them, not prove it or whatever, just to bring a little bit of weight and measure to the immeasurable experience. I think that's important, right? Especially now that that sort of thing can be done. So what I'm trying to say is, it's not necessarily because Krishnamurti didn't speak to mad people or didn't think his teachings applied to them. His audience was like kind of upper class people in general. Because we are people with bipolar, we need a completely different approach, right? It's not necessarily the same as Krishnamurti's. So I like to explore Krishnamurti's teachings, but he probably would say, don't talk about your experiences. And I say to myself, I'm going to talk about my experiences, What does he know for that? He doesn't know. And he's not alive, right? So I'm just saying that it's important to have dialogue with and learn from almost anything, but each person's journey is different, right? Some people might not want to talk about their experiences. He probably didn't want to talk about his experiences because people would think he was nuts, right? Whereas people who have a diagnosis of bipolar, people already think they're nuts, so we can talk about it. That's what it is. So we didn't get to the stream of consciousness writing, and I think I'll finish up with these last little bits here. One of them is that I've had this page open for a while, and it's a definition of glossomania. And it says, also known as clanging or semantic glossomania, refers to a speech pattern characterized by the use of words or phrases that are linked by sound or rhyme rather than meaning. It's often associated with mental disorders. I remember having it open before and it said something else. And I'll say it anyway, even though it's not here, but it said something about an obsession with the perfect language, which seemed like changing language to make it perfect. And seeing as I like to create neologisms and these transmutations, that might be interpreted as a type of glossomania, but I really like playing with language. I'm not trying to make a perfect language. A perfect language is imperfect. It's perfectly growing and changing. But what stuck out for me from this AI overview definition is it says that in these cases, when it's part of a thought disorder, the connections between words are often nonsensical and may impede communication. So in a sense, if a person has glossomania or clanging, one can iterate and adapt and get to a point where it's not nonsensical and doesn't impede communication. But I will add that really it takes perhaps quite some time to be in dialogue and extrapolate and iterate on the thoughts or words so that they do make sense. So in essence, we can impede our own communication. We need to impede the urge to communicate these things before we sort of learn the language of it, which is the same language that we speak with these different powers in it rather than these old forces. And it could actually be a sign that those old forces are breaking down, which are the forces that hold the system of thought as the self together. And then in a crisis, we're speaking differently and it's sort of disordered because we don't have these forces holding it all together. But if we go into the power of these memes that are coming through that maybe aren't connected, maybe seem somewhat nonsensical, and receive them and honor them, and sort of impede our urge to communicate them with others so they don't think we're nuts, and put them together. Then when we do communicate them, they make sense, though people still may not receive them. They're still difficult to communicate, though potentially easily understood, at least abstractly and conceptually. And then finding the ones that may point to what these memes point to, which is beyond abstraction, is another thing altogether. But being or having a sense of feeling together, that they're not nonsensical. And, an example I'll give is that when I wrote a bunch of stuff down to write that turned into my first book and potentially a few more, and I did write the second one, it was just coming through insight by insight. Each statement made sense, but they didn't make sense in that order. If I would have just published it in that order, it wouldn't have made any sense. So I had to take time to type them up and put them in some kind of order that was some semblance of order. But that happened because I wrote them all down, right? One by one. I didn't say, this first one doesn't make sense. I better, not write these or whatever. And then I was able to put them together. So, whether that's for a book or just in general, writing them down and documenting them in any kind of way, then we can take the time to put them in some kind of order. And it's kind of like thought helps to do that. So this exercise could be thought being used to help put these insights that are not of thought, not of the forces of the self, not from within that limited structure, into order, right? So that's why I think it's also important to do that. And I think I said something like this before, but what I'm sensing now is how important that is to include sort of thought, the self, and the left brain in putting those insights together, because it creates a connection between the two hemispheres, right? So that's why engaging in sorting and all that is engaging the left hemisphere in the right hemisphere content and in the right hemisphere insights. So that's why it's important to document it when it's in the extraordinary state, and then not try and make connections between them and not try and say them to others and all that when it's in that state. Like if you're all of a sudden, say, lucid, as we've been saying, you don't want to say every lucid thought you have to the stranger next to you, right? Because it'll probably be disjointed and everything. So then when you are no longer in the lucid extraordinary state, you look at them and read them and put them in some kind of logical-ish order. And it's important, I think, to do that with our own brain, like I had the opportunity to do pre-ChatGPT. So that's what I'm seeing there. So it does say here it's not always a disorder, because, rhyming and wordplay is not only a sign of mental disorder. It says clanging is only considered a symptom when it disrupts communication and is a consistent pattern of speech. So this is like, if you're in that clanging glossomania state, even has mania in it. Some mania, one part of mania is glossomania. It's like, then don't talk to other people. Talk into a recording. Even if you're not writing down insights, but you're trying to rap and rhyme or make poetry. So there's ways that we can alter our behavior that it's not now part of a disorder because of how we're able to create a safe space for it and a sacred space for it. And then it talks about semantic glossomania, the intrusion of unrelated phrases into a conversation, right? So here it's saying into a conversation. So it's like, if we don't talk to people about this, we don't try to have a conversation about it, if we don't try to communicate with other people, it's not really a problem, right? It's a source of creativity, but it's not necessarily a source of conversation. It's a sore spot in conversation. People don't like when you go on making random associations and rhyming and clanging and stuff like that. So it says semantic glossomania, phrases are linked by association even if the connection is not logically apparent. So here I see a link to, we were talking about synchronicity. So I made a little synchronicity association, which could almost be a semantic glossomania in a way. But I can see that for myself and think it for myself and write it down for myself and say it to myself. And I said it on this recording. But if I just said that to like a random person, if we were just talking and they were holding the notebook, and then I saw that, and then I was like, oh, gray matter and blah, 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 blah. They don't want to know that per se, unless you're with a synchronous person. That it would be like, okay, tag in my mind, when I'm done this conversation, I'm going to write that down in my ecstasography, because it's kind of neat, right? It's like a private thing. These like meaningful things and these messages are kind of a private thing. It's like a private conversation. And I'm saying that as I'm like sharing these conversations, but is it okay? Yeah. So anyway, so we can also use our clanging. Like what happened to me one time was I wrote a spoken word slam poetry thing based on my book, just sort of finding some of the main terms, and some of it's clanging. So I'm using the strength of clanging in a format or medium, like spoken word writing, that is okay and would be okay if I spoke it out loud and made a video about it, or if I was doing like an open mic or something like that, right? And it says thought disorder. It's also a symptom of thought disorder in schizophrenia and bipolar, where it can manifest as disorganized speech and difficulty in maintaining a coherent train of thought. Well, it's the self that helps to maintain that coherent train of thought that is the one we're supposed to put forth in society. And with insight, you don't really have a train of thought. We don't want to have trains of thought, at least eventually. We want to have insights, which are prompts, and then a dialogue of insight, a dialogue based on insight, not a train of thought. That train is from the forces within thought that we've been talking about. But either way, we can get to a place where it's not disorganized speech. And rather than trying to go back into maintaining a coherent train of thought, look into thought and the forces and go beyond that with silence and dialogue. And it gives an example. Someone might use words that rhyme or sound alike even if they don't make sense together. Like saying, I'm not making sense anymore, I need to make dollars. Or they put sense spelt like money, C-E-N-T-S. Now that's actually fine if it was a rap line, right? And that rhymed too. Or if it was marketing, right? But I think this is part of our speech that we could pepper in, much like every now and then we put in a joke. So more people might start doing that. And speaking of wordplay, a friend of mine is researching or just sort of learning about tryptophan. It's an amino acid. And then I sent them a little bit of something that I know about tryptophan, which I find interesting, which I want to research more at some point. And then they sent back, it's trippy, but they spelled it T-Y-R-P-Y, like it's trippy. And I thought, wow, that's a good one. Like, I think that's really good. Because tryptophan is associated with, well, it makes serotonin. It's a precursor, right? And we need enough serotonin, otherwise we could start tripping out, or who knows which way is tripping, really. I think thinking the way we think, being used by language the way we are used, is tripping over thought. We're always tripping over the filter. Trip, trip, trip. And each time we trip, our head moves in such a way that we're not really seeing what is. So I like when people make up words with me, or play on words, play with language, it's fun. And then also seeing something I don't see. But then when they share it, it's like, oh yes, that's a good one. Like, that's not a joke, but it's kind of laughing. I want to use the word yoke. It says in aeronautics, a yoke is a control column that a pilot uses to control the aircraft's elevators or ailerons. I remember someone saying that yoga means yoke. So in a way, that's a good yoke. It's sort of like partner yoga in language, like posing with language, posing words. So lastly, as we were talking a while ago about shared vulnerability traits and people labeled with mental illnesses not having as much creative accomplishment and things like that, I was just scribbling down that re-uncovery is sort of, part of it is, equity and creative accomplishment. So people might be really creative, but they need help with the accomplishment part. They've accomplished it, but they need to accomplish the accomplishment part by, things that are sometimes challenging at first, at least. Because I'm not fresh on my genetics, but really this creative potential, if there weren't people who were, had double creativity, we're just calling it that, extra vulnerability, then it would likely be removed from the population over time. We need these people that are full into it in order to make sure that it stays within the population. And it's also equity in meaning, like to be able to say what the world means and participate with that. And equity in near-death experience transformation, right? And a lot of other approaches. So I think we've said a lot today. And next, I would like to read some of the stream of consciousness. And perhaps I will attempt not to watch anything else, work on some writing projects, and then hopefully actually get to read this. And I'm also seeing a few other tweaks that I can do in order to get into creating some short form content, which I've always resisted, or perhaps it just wasn't happening or meant to happen at that time. Till tomorrow, peace out.